He had 12 seconds of firepower, 40 enemy planes waiting on the ground, and one impossible choice: to wait for orders or dive into hell alone. 3 days before the Marines stormed the beaches of Peleliu, Major Robert Cowboy Stout climbed into the cockpit of his F-6F Hellcat aboard the USS Hornet. The Pacific sun was already fierce by 8 a.m., beating down on a deck alive with motion. Deck crews shouting over engines, the smell of fuel mixing with salt air, the deck trembling under the rhythm of propellers. Stout had flown 63 combat missions by then. He knew the sound of takeoff drills, the burn of exhaust in his throat, the brief silence before a launch officer dropped his hand. But that morning felt different. The briefing the night before had been vague, almost careless, a simple reconnaissance run over a small island called Peleliu, just another name lost in the map of the Palau Islands. He was to fly east, take photographs of a supposedly abandoned airfield, and return to base. Routine, they said. What he didn't know was that intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. Within an hour, his routine patrol would turn into one of the most audacious solo strikes in the history of naval aviation. A decision made in seconds that would alter the fate of an entire invasion. The first sight of Peleliu was deceptively peaceful. From 8,000 feet, the island looked almost ordinary, a crescent of coral and jungle fringed by surf, shimmering beneath a thin veil of morning haze. To Major Robert Cowboy Stout, it seemed like one of 100 other airfields he had photographed in the Pacific. The routine was mechanical by now. Set the camera interval, maintain altitude, hold a steady course. The mission was supposed to be uneventful, an intelligence formality before the Marines launched their assault on Peleliu 3 days later. But as the coastline slid beneath his wings, the illusion shattered. The airfield was not silent. It was crowded, alive with motion. Even from altitude, Stout could see them. Rows of aircraft glinting in the sunlight, parked wingtip to wingtip across the coral runway. He felt the instant, visceral realization of a combat pilot who knew exactly what he was looking at. The Japanese hadn't abandoned Peleliu, they had turned it into a launch platform. He banked slightly, sunlight flashing across the canopy as he counted. Mitsubishi A6M0s, Nakajima B5N torpedo bombers, Aichi D3A dive bombers, the workhorses of the Imperial Navy's air arm. All were armed, fueled, and lined up in neat, disciplined rows that stretched along the northern shore. There were at least 40 aircraft in sight, perhaps more hidden near the tree line. To the trained eye, this was not a garrison. It was a strike group waiting for the signal to take off. If those planes launched, the results would be catastrophic. Each bomber carried enough ordnance to cripple a transport ship, and the invasion fleet was full of them. Slow, unarmored vessels, packed with Marines, supplies, and fuel. A single coordinated attack could rip through the task force before it ever reached the beach. Stout understood immediately that what he saw could determine the fate of the entire Peleliu operation. His thumb hovered over the radio switch. The handbook answer was clear. Report the find, return to base, and let command coordinate a proper strike. But the veteran inside him knew what that meant. Delay, skepticism, bureaucracy. By the time the message reached fleet intelligence, the Japanese would scatter their planes into revetments or conceal them under camouflage nets. The perfect target in front of him would vanish. Stout dropped to 3,000 feet for another pass, trading altitude for detail. The camera behind him kept clicking automatically, but his own eyes were doing the real reconnaissance now. The airfield's single runway cut through the island like a scar, with dispersal areas branching out on either side. Along the edges, he saw fuel drums, stacked beside each aircraft, hundreds of them, unprotected, glistening in the heat. Whoever commanded this base had been preparing for a major operation and had ignored every safety protocol in the book. Through the canopy, he could make out the human scale of the scene. Ground crews rolling fuel barrels, mechanics bent over open engines, ordnance teams hauling bombs toward the aircraft. None of them seemed aware that an American fighter was circling overhead. To them, it was probably just another Recon run, a distant, harmless speck against the blinding Sunday. But to Stout, it was something else entirely. He realized he was looking at a mistake so vast it could end a battle before it began. The Japanese had packed their air power together, side by side, sitting on top of their own explosives. One well-placed attack could ignite the entire base. As he leveled his Hellcat for another pass, Stout felt the familiar, quiet shift that every combat pilot recognized, the moment when training overtakes uncertainty, when fear becomes calculation. He wasn't just photographing the target anymore. He was memorizing its weak points, one heartbeat at a time. Major Robert Cowboy Stout leveled his F-6F Hellcat after the second reconnaissance pass, the aircraft's wings slicing through the humid Pacific air with a faint whistle. The camera behind the cockpit kept clicking, indifferent and mechanical. But Stout's eyes, trained by 63 combat missions and sharpened by the unforgiving arithmetic of aerial warfare, saw more than any lens. What sprawled across the coral expanse of Peleliu wasn't the abandoned airstrip intelligence had promised. It was a fortress in waiting, a lethal assembly of Imperial Japanese air power poised to strike. From 3,000 feet, the details snapped into deadly clarity. Rows of aircraft lined the single runway with parade ground precision. He counted methodically, banking for angle. Mitsubishi A-6M0s dominated the northern dispersal. Interspersed were Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3A dive bombers. At least 40, perhaps more tucked into the fringe of jungle shade, fueled, armed, props still, engines primed. Ground activity confirmed it. Khaki-clad crews moved with practiced economy. Mechanics hunched over open cowlings. Ordnance teams trundled bombs and torpedoes into place. Fuel trucks idled with hoses snaking to wing tanks. And stacked beside nearly every aircraft. Hundreds of drums, unprotected, shimmering with heat haze. This wasn't a garrison. It was a strike group, preparing to hit the invasion fleet in 3 days. The implications hit like flak. If those planes launched, the Marine slow transports would be slaughtered. Zeros for cover. B-5 Noints and D-3, as to tear ships open. He'd heard that kind of radio traffic in earlier campaigns. The frantic calls, the oil slicks, the drifting debris. One decisive raid here could stall the whole operation and cost thousands. His thumb hovered over the transmit switch. Doctrine said, report, return, and let the fleet build a strike package. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, the safe, systematic way. But Pacific radio nets were bottlenecks, and skepticism was a habit. In 90 minutes, 2 hours more likely, the Japanese would disperse under nets, shove into revetments, or launch first. The perfect target would evaporate. War wasn't won by procedure alone, it was seized in windows measured in heartbeats. Dropping to 2,000 feet, he traded altitude for intel. The runway cut the island like a white scar, dispersal pads branching like veins. No meaningful revetments over confidence or haste. The fuel drums were the key, clusters of 5 or 10 at each wing. High-octane gas didn't just burn, it vapor, detonated, sending pressure waves across open tarmac. He pictured it. One incendiary into a drum, flame jumping to tanks, then to fuel lines, bombs, ammunition. What his guns didn't kill, physics would. Speaking of guns, 6 Browning M, 2 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing with 400 rounds in each gun. The ammo was a mix of armor, piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. The guns were harmonized for 300 yards. At about 750 rounds per minute per gun, he had roughly 12 seconds of continuous fire. 12 seconds against 40 aircraft, suicidal on paper. But the geometry favored him. Wingtips nearly kissing. No fire breaks. A perpendicular strafe could walk fire across multiple rows. Hit the fuel first. Let the inferno do the multiplying. It wasn't about killing every plane with bullets. It was about starting a fire no one could put out. The risks clawed back. In the ridgelines were Type 96 25mm autocannons, fast-firing and lethal inside 2,000 yards. Once he committed, the island would wake in tracers. One hit could open a fuel line, sever hydraulics, or punch the canopy. Humidity could jam the guns. A bad pull-up could scythe him into the trees at 300 miles per hour. No wingman, no rescue. He thought of the Hornet's crew who'd tuned the R-2800, the letters waiting at home. 63 sorties behind him, but luck is finite. Protocol offered safety. Instinct offered impact. This airfield was the hinge of Peleliu. Neutralize it now, and the Marines hit sand under a clear sky. Wait, and the horizon fills with enemy silhouettes. Gauges steady, fuel, oil, ammo. The Pratt & Whitney rumbled, 2,000 horsepower alive under his hand. The cockpit shrank to oxygen mask, harness, gun sight. Judgment made itself. He exhaled, wrapped his hand around the throttle, and pushed. The nose dipped. The altimeter unwound. Jungle surged upward. The airfield widened in the glass. No radio call, no permission. In the next 30 seconds he would either etch his name into naval legend or vanish in the fire he was about to unleash. The Hellcat dropped like a hawk spotting prey, its shadow slicing across the jungle canopy. The altimeter unwound, 2,000 feet, then 1,500. At barely 50 feet above the treetops, Stout was skimming so low that palm fronds whipped violently in his prop wash. At this altitude, he was below most radar coverage and inside the zone where anti-aircraft gunners struggled to track anything moving this fast. The only sounds were the deep thunder of the R-2800 engine and his own steady breathing in the headset. Ahead, the Peleliu airfield rushed toward him like a living target. He had maybe 3 seconds to finalize his attack geometry. The Japanese planes were parked in neat, parallel rows along the runway, all facing northeast. He planned to attack perpendicular to those rows, cutting across multiple lines of aircraft in a single pass, instead of chasing down one at a time. One burst. Maximum effect. His airspeed held at 310 miles per hour as he broke through the final line of jungle. The entire airfield opened up before him, a shooting gallery of death and opportunity. The details came into focus with terrifying clarity. Ground crewmen looked up in confusion, faces turning to panic as realization set in. Fuel drums stood stacked beside each aircraft. A Zero sat with its cowling open, mechanics still checking the engine. Every plane was loaded, armed, and utterly exposed. Stout's thumb found the firing button on the stick. The 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns were set to fire, so their streams of bullets met 300 yards ahead, creating a cone of fire that could chew through steel and flesh alike. Each gun spat a mix of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds designed to punch through thin aluminum and ignite whatever waited behind it. He pressed the trigger. The Hellcat shuddered violently as all 6 guns came alive. The sound was raw, continuous, like tearing canvas amplified through thunder. Red tracers streaked from his wings, every 5th round glowing as it screamed toward the targets. He aimed for the gap between 2 Zeros, where he'd seen the cluster of fuel drums. The 50 caliber rounds swept across the coral runway, stirring up white dust before tearing into the first aircraft's fuselage. The Zero's thin metal skin peeled away like foil. He held the trigger for 2 full seconds, about 150 rounds total, then nudged the stick slightly left. The tracers struck the fuel drums. The explosion wasn't a single blast, but a chain reaction, one fireball rolling into another. Aviation gasoline doesn't just burn, it detonates when vaporized. The first drum erupted, igniting its neighbors, and the resulting overpressure wave slammed into the nearby aircraft like a hammer. The Zero vanished in a secondary blast, and the Inferno leapt sideways across the line of planes. Stout didn't wait to admire it. He adjusted aim and raked a Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, a bigger, heavier target swollen with fuel for a long-range strike. When that one went up, the shock wave buffeted his Hellcat, jolting him in the harness. 4 seconds into the run, and the world behind him was already coming apart. The airfield was disintegrating. Flames spread across the tarmac faster than he imagined, racing along rivulets of fuel that shimmered like molten glass. Ground crews were scattering, some diving for ditches, others frozen in disbelief. A fuel truck took a burst of his fire and exploded, flipping sideways and adding another 1,000 gallons of flame to the growing firestorm. The heat hit him even through the cockpit glass. Waves of thermal distortion blurred the world ahead. His ammunition counters ticked down rapidly, half his load gone in the first strike, but the destruction below was multiplying far beyond what bullets alone could have done. The Japanese had built their own death trap. Aircraft packed wingtip to wingtip, fuel stacked in the open, minimal firefighting gear, and untrained ground crews. Every single one of those mistakes was now feeding the Inferno. Anti-aircraft guns finally started responding. Flashes of 25mm fire blinked from the jungle edge, tracers arcing up wildly. They were shooting blind, firing into smoke and chaos. Stout's Hellcat was already past their sights, too low, too fast. He kept firing as he crossed the third and fourth rows of parked aircraft. A line of dive bombers absorbed the full fury of his guns. One of them still carried bombs slung under its wings. He saw them, just for an instant, before his tracers found them. The result was catastrophic. A massive detonation tore through the southern dispersal area. A mushroom cloud of black smoke billowed skyward, shock waves slamming through the air. 2 nearby Zeros were shredded like paper, their wings folding and twisting in the heat. Fragments of debris pinged off Stout's canopy as he screamed overhead. 9 seconds since the first burst. Behind him, the entire northern half of the airfield was engulfed. The ground shook with continuous secondary explosions. Ammunition cooking off, wing tanks bursting, cannon shells detonating in violent staccato bursts. The sky was filled with flame and smoke. The smell of burning aluminum and gasoline rolled upward in waves. Stout pulled back on the stick, climbing hard to escape the rising column of heat. The Hellcat bucked and trembled as it punched through turbulent air. In his rearview mirror he saw hell itself, rows of aircraft consumed in fire, black smoke columns merging into one giant tower of destruction. Men were running for their lives below, shadows flickering against the blaze. The airfield was gone. Its order, its discipline, its deadly calm, replaced by chaos, fire, and ruin. From 500 feet up, the Peleliu airfield looked less like a target and more like a living creature dying in slow motion. Fire pulsed through its veins, the runways, the fuel lines, the rows of aircraft, each explosion another heartbeat collapsing into chaos. What Stout had begun as a precise, disciplined strike was now beyond control. The base was burning itself alive, and he circled above it, the lone witness to a man-made apocalypse. Below him, the devastation expanded by the second. Flames leapt from one aircraft to the next, fed by rivers of high-octane fuel streaming across the coral. Every few moments, another detonation rolled outward, scattering metal fragments and shock waves that rippled through the smoke. Ammunition inside the parked planes began to cook off. First pistol rounds, then came the .30 caliber belts, followed by 20mm shells bursting in angry, rhythmic flashes. The sounds merged into one continuous roar, part hurricane, part inferno. Thick black smoke twisted upward, visible for 50 miles out to sea. The heat distorted the horizon, bending light until the world below shimmered like molten glass. Ground crews trapped between the burning airfield and the jungle wall ran for their lives. Stout caught fleeting glimpses of them. Tiny silhouettes darting between fireballs, some throwing themselves into ditches, others waving rags at flames that had already claimed the entire dispersal area. A fuel truck went up in a massive orange bloom, flipping sideways before vanishing into the blaze. Even inside the cockpit, the temperature climbed. Stout could feel the heat through his gloves and flight suit. The air smelled of cordite, burning aluminum, and gasoline, a combination that marked both victory and horror. He'd spent half his ammunition, roughly 1,200 rounds, yet the destruction below had multiplied far beyond what bullets alone could achieve. The Japanese had designed their own demise. Planes parked too close, drums of fuel beside every wing, and no organized firefighting system to stop the chain reaction. He pulled back hard on the stick, climbing to gain altitude and reassess. Tracers clawed upward from the jungle, 25mm bursts flashing in red and white arcs. The gunners had found their range, filling the air with lethal geometry. A near miss shook the Hellcat, the explosion punching a hole through the air just off his right wing. But panic had already taken hold down there. Most of the fire was wild, uncontrolled, desperate. From that height, the picture was devastatingly clear. The northern section of the airfield where he'd made his first pass was gone. A graveyard of burning metal. Aircraft lay in twisted piles, wings collapsed, engines buried in smoke. But to the south, more than 20 planes remained intact. He watched them taxiing in frantic motion, ground crews waving them toward the tree line. Engines coughed, Wheels skidded on flaming fuel, and some planes collided as pilots tried to escape the inferno consuming their comrades. They were turning themselves into perfect moving targets. He leveled off, keeping the airfield framed in his canopy. The flames below climbed higher than the palms, thick smoke merging into one colossal pillar visible to every ship in the invasion fleet. Whatever doubts the Navy had about the scale of Japanese air power in this sector, they would soon have their answer. Stout checked his gauges. Fuel low but manageable, guns half empty, engine still strong. The mission wasn't finished. As long as a single enemy aircraft remained capable of flight, the Marines heading toward Peleliu were still in danger. He tightened the harness across his shoulders, rolled the Hellcat slightly to test control, and pushed the throttle forward again. The engine responded with that deep, confident thunder only the R-2800 could make. Down below, the inferno raged unchecked. And Stout was going back in, not out of impulse or anger, but with the cold clarity of a man who understood exactly what had to be done. Stout nosed the Hellcat down again, feeling the aircraft tighten under his control. The second pass was going to be different and far more dangerous. The element of surprise was gone. Every gun on the island was now awake. Every Japanese crewman on the airfield knew what was coming. The first strike had turned their base into chaos. This one would turn it into extinction. He came in from a new direction, approaching from the southeast instead of retracing his original route. Rule number 1 of ground attack: never repeat your pattern. Gunners learned fast, and he knew they'd already plotted his previous run. Now they were waiting, their 25mm barrels aimed skyward, elevation wheels spinning, nerves stretched thin. Smoke made the approach treacherous. Thick black columns rose thousands of feet into the air, drifting and twisting in the wind. Flying through it felt like plunging into another world. Turbulence buffeting the Hellcat, visibility down to seconds. His airspeed dropped to around 280 miles per hour, just enough to keep control and to pick his shots carefully. Faster meant safety, slower meant precision. Today, precision mattered more. Below, he could see what was left of the southern dispersal area, and it was still alive. Several planes were moving, being taxied frantically by ground crews toward the jungle's edge. Others sat half-fueled, engines coughing, trying to start amid the smoke and heat. They were the last remnants of a strike force that just minutes earlier had been poised to attack the American fleet. Stout's jaw tightened. He wasn't going to give them that chance. Anti-aircraft fire erupted again. Tracers streaked past his canopy, bright red lines cutting through the grey haze. One burst exploded just 30 feet off his left wing, showering the fuselage with fragments. Another went off dead ahead, forcing him to yank the stick right and drop altitude to avoid the shrapnel cloud. The Hellcat bucked under the strain, but the controls held firm. He remembered his training. Never fly straight for more than 2 seconds. Change altitude, change direction, change speed. Make yourself impossible to predict. He weaved through the firestorm, the jungle blurring beneath him, then lined up on a cluster of 5 Zeros taxiing for cover. He opened fire. The first burst tore into the lead aircraft, a stream of incendiary rounds slicing from propeller to tail. The Zero's fuselage burst into flame, the pilot scrambling from the cockpit only to disappear in a flash of fire. Stout shifted his aim and stitched the next plane, punching through its engine cowling. Coolant sprayed outward in a white mist before the plane ground to a halt. 3 more bursts. 2 more fighters crippled. The 5th made it to the tree line before a final burst caught its wing route. Fuel ignited and the aircraft nosed over into the jungle, burning where it landed. Stout's guns clicked empty on the left side. The 3 port wing Brownings had run dry. He still had his right side guns, about 300 rounds total, but the imbalance made aiming tricky. The recoil pulled the aircraft to the left every time he fired. He compensated with rudder pressure, feeling the kick through his legs as he adjusted. Ahead, a pair of dive bombers sat near a camouflaged revetment. They looked intact, possibly being armed for a last-ditch strike. He lined them up in his gun sight and squeezed the trigger. Tracers walked across both aircraft, punching holes through wings and cockpits. One went up instantly, a flash of orange and black. The other bled fuel, leaking a silver trail until the spreading flames reached it, and then both vanished in a twin explosion that rocked the airfield all over again. A sudden jolt shook the Hellcat. Something had hit him, solid and heavy. The whole plane shuddered. Stout's eyes shot to the instrument panel. Oil pressure steady, hydraulics good, flight controls responsive. Whatever it was, it hadn't crippled him. But it was a reminder that luck had limits. Every second he stayed over that airfield was another second borrowed from fate. He squeezed off one last burst, targeting a fuel truck parked near the runway. The tracers found it instantly. The explosion was violent, bright enough to blind him for a heartbeat. The truck vanished, leaving only a rolling fireball and a spreading sheet of flame that consumed everything nearby. By the time he released the trigger, he realized every one of his 2,400 rounds had been fired, spent in roughly 15 seconds of actual trigger time across 2 passes. 15 seconds of gunfire that had turned an entire Japanese airbase into a furnace. Stout pulled back hard, climbing toward the open sky and the promise of ocean air. His heart was pounding, adrenaline still surging as he cleared the last line of smoke. The Hellcat trembled but held steady, the engine roaring in steady defiance. He leveled off at 2,000 feet, breathing hard, sweat stinging his eyes. The gauges showed fuel running low, but the engine still held steady, faithful as ever. Below, the island was disappearing behind a curtain of fire and smoke. He stayed there for a few moments longer, silent inside the roar of the engine, watching what he had done. The airfield that had once been a threat to an entire invasion fleet was now nothing but a smouldering scar on the jungle floor. He banked west, toward the sea, the Hellcat trembling as it caught the morning light. The mission wasn't over yet, not until he made it home. Behind him, the airfield at Peleliu was dying. From his vantage point high above the island, Stout could see the fire spreading in every direction, a living inferno consuming metal, fuel, and men alike. What had once been a neat grid of runways and dispersal zones was now a single glowing wound stretching across the coral. The smoke was so dense it blurred the sea horizon, a black tower rising more than 10,000 feet into the blue. He eased the throttle back, letting the Hellcat climb steadily to safer altitude. The cockpit smelled of cordite and hot oil, the residue of battle seeping into every breath. For the first time in the mission, he allowed himself to feel the silence. No gunfire, no radio chatter, just the hum of the engine and the faint crackle of distant explosions below. It was hard to process what he'd just done. In less than 10 minutes of flying time, one pilot in one aircraft had neutralized the entire Japanese air presence in the Peleliu sector. 40 planes destroyed or rendered useless. Fighters, bombers, and fuel stores erased before they could ever take off. The realization hit him slowly, not as pride, but as disbelief. He'd seen airfields before, intact, organized, and lethal. He'd seen them burn, too, but never like this. The precision of his first run, the chaos of the second, and the chain reaction that followed had combined into something beyond tactics. It was as if the laws of chance had bent for just long enough to hand him the perfect target at the perfect time. From 5 miles out, the scale became even more visible. The entire northern sector of Peleliu was a sea of fire, and the southern end was still detonating in random bursts, secondary explosions from ammunition stores and ruptured fuel tanks. The heat shimmer reached high into the air, distorting light, turning the island into a mirage of destruction. He thought of the invasion fleet, steaming toward Peleliu just beyond the horizon. The Marines aboard those transports had no idea how close they'd come to disaster. Each of those Japanese bombers could have meant a burning ship, 1,000 men lost before they ever touched sand. Stout had seen what happened when air superiority failed, ships breaking apart, men trapped below decks, the sea turned to fire. Not this time. But the thought didn't bring triumph. What filled him instead was a quiet awareness of scale, how a single decision made in the span of a heartbeat could ripple outward through an entire war. He hadn't been ordered to attack. No one had told him what to do. The strike had been his call alone. The Hellcat's gauges trembled in the heat. Fuel was running low. He'd burned more than planned during the dive sequences. He trimmed the aircraft, setting a course back toward the USS Hornet, now 50 miles away across the open Pacific. The smoke from Peleliu was still visible, even as he gained distance, a black column marking both destruction and salvation. He keyed the radio but hesitated. What was there to say? How do you summarize what had just happened? After a pause, he spoke with the flat calm of a man who'd already lived through the impossible. "Control, this is Stout," he said. "Mission complete. Airfield neutralized, returning to base." The reply came seconds later, incredulous and clipped. "Say again, Stout. Did you say neutralized?" "Affirmative," Stout said. "It's gone." He eased the throttle forward, the Hellcat banking gently toward the open sea. The island of Peleliu slipped behind him, still burning, a pillar of black smoke rising like a monument to chaos. The Pacific stretched out ahead, calm, endless, indifferent. After the fury of the last 10 minutes, the sudden quiet felt almost unreal. The gauges on his instrument panel flickered. Fuel low, but steady. Engine temperature holding. The air smelled faintly of gunpowder and scorched paint, the lingering breath of the battle he'd just escaped. He loosened his grip on the stick for the first time all morning. The metal was slick with sweat beneath his gloves. For 40 minutes, he flew alone through the blue. The Hellcat vibrated with a constant, reassuring hum, the kind of sound only a pilot who trusted his machine could love. Far below, whitecaps drifted lazily across the ocean surface. It was hard to believe that somewhere just beyond the horizon, an entire invasion fleet was steaming toward that same island, and that its survival now hinged on what one man had done. At last, the shape of the USS Hornet emerged from the haze. A flat grey line against the water, tiny at first, then growing clearer with every mile. Over the radio, the familiar rhythm of deck operations filled his ears. Landing clearances, fuel reports, pilots checking in from patrol. Routine voices in a world that had almost stopped feeling real. "Hornet Control, this is Stout," he said evenly, requesting landing instructions. A pause. Then a voice came back, half incredulous, half relieved. "Copy that, Stout. You're cleared for approach. Welcome home." He set the Hellcat into its descent pattern, circling once before lining up with the carrier deck. The sea wind buffeted his wings. The ship rolled gently beneath him. He dropped the landing gear, lowered the flaps, checked the tailhook light, all green. As the deck grew larger in his windscreen, he could see crewmen already pointing upward, shouting to each other. The tailhook caught the number 3 wire with a violent jolt. The plane slammed forward, then stopped dead in less than 2 seconds. The impact rattled through his bones. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, and then the deck erupted in motion. Crewmen ran toward him from all directions. Mechanics, ordnance handlers, men in coloured jerseys who'd spent the morning watching that distant column of smoke and wondering what had caused it. Now they could see the answer. A Hellcat peppered with holes, wings scorched, hydraulic fluid streaking down the fuselage. One plane captain climbed the wing to help him out of the cockpit, then froze when he saw the empty ammunition counters. "Jesus, sir," the man muttered, eyes wide. "You used all of it." "Every round," Stout said quietly, unbuckling his harness. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, flat, detached, and almost calm. By the time his boots touched the deck, half the flight crew had gathered around, saying nothing as the smell of jet fuel, salt, and disbelief filled the air. Far out on the horizon, the smoke from Peleliu still climbed into the sky, dark against the soft light of morning, and everyone on deck understood what that sight meant. They all knew who had caused it. An hour later, Stout sat in the carrier's intelligence room, the steady hum of the ship running like a faint vibration through the floor, while maps and photographs covered the table. Senior officers leaned over the documents, making notes as he described each moment of the attack, the altitudes, the headings, the bursts of gunfire, and the enemy's brief, desperate response. "How many passes did you make?" one of them asked. "Two." "All ammunition expended?" "Yes, sir. Every round." End quote. "Were you hit?" He nodded once. "Tail section, non-critical." The questions kept coming, each a different form of the same disbelief. Hours later, when the photo Recon planes returned, their images told the rest of the story. 40 aircraft destroyed, runways cratered, fuel stores gone. an airbase erased from the map. For a moment, the room fell silent. No one quite knew what to say. When the briefing finally ended, Stout stood, saluted, and left without ceremony. Outside, the flight deck glowed orange in the late-day sun as aircraft were refueled for the next missions, the rhythm of routine already returning, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. The news moved faster than the ship. Before dawn the next morning, the ready room knew, the wardroom knew, the mess decks knew. Word spread the way it always does at sea, on the lift of a rumor and the certainty of a photograph. By noon, the Recon prints were pinned to corkboard under a red bulb. 40 aircraft reduced to twisted ribs, the runway a scorched seam through the jungle, fuel drums blackened and burst like drums of coal. No one argued with the evidence. The citation came down from higher up in crisp Navy language, drafted with the careful symmetry of official memory. It spoke of extraordinary heroism, conspicuous gallantry, and aerial combat against enemy Japanese forces. It recorded the date, the unit, the aircraft type, the geographic coordinates that turned a nameless island into a line in a logbook, and somewhere in the middle of it, almost as an aside, it noted that the pilot had attacked alone. When they read it aloud in the ready room, the applause was brief and awkward, the kind of clapping men do when they aren't sure if they're congratulating courage or survival. Someone whistled once, then cut it off. A few pilots drifted forward to shake Stout's hand, their eyes caught between curiosity and respect. He thanked them quietly, said almost nothing else, and sat down to strap on his kneeboard for the afternoon sortie. The Navy Cross didn't arrive with fanfare. It showed up weeks later, announced on the board with the day's flight schedule and a notice about mess hours. They gave it to him on the hangar deck between engine tests, the ship's heartbeat rattling the rivets in the wall. A few officers were there. Someone found a flag to stand behind. He stood at attention while the words were read, accepted the medal, and tucked the ribbon case into a pocket of his flight jacket. Then he went back to the line, signed for a helmet, and climbed a ladder to the flight deck, because there were still missions to fly. The men who had watched him land the day before, who had seen the holes stitched through the tail, the scorched enamel along the wings, treated him differently now, but not by much. A little more space at the coffee urn. A little more quiet when he walked in. Deck crew nodded and looked away, not out of rudeness, but because reverence is easier to carry when it isn't stared at. At night, the sea did what it always does, flattened sound, deepened shadows, and pulled the ship forward under a sky crowded with stars. Stout wrote home on Navy stationery, 2 paragraphs about weather and food and how he was fine. He left out the smoke, the noise, the way the cockpit smelled after a run. He left out the medal. He had learned, like most combat men do, that there are things the heart can carry that language cannot. There were more sorties, more briefings, more names added to the board and erased again. The war did not pause to frame a photograph. It rolled on in schedules and distances and fuel loads. And Stout rolled with it, the way he always had, early to the ready room, steady in the air, quiet on the return. The medal would follow him ashore eventually, printed in programs and mentioned in introductions. But aboard the Hornet, on that moving city of steel and salt, it was simpler. The ship measured men by whether they launched and whether they came back. Stout launched, Stout came back, and the next morning he launched again.